We found a way down that isn't on any map, and there's something living at the bottom." Those were Mitchell Crane's last coherent words before he stopped speaking English entirely and started communicating in a language that linguists at the University of Kentucky couldn't identify, couldn't even classify into a known language family. A system of clicks and tonal shifts and guttural sounds that seemed designed for throats that had evolved differently than human throats, for vocal cords that had developed in absolute darkness over timescales that made human civilization look like yesterday's news. Mitchell led research teams in Mammoth Cave for 11 years, personally mapping over 30 miles of previously unknown passages, learning things about the cave system that cannot be learned from training manuals or academic programs, but by spending thousands of hours underground, crawling through passages so narrow he could barely breathe where the limestone was so tightly packed, swimming through pools of water where the only air was what he carried in his lungs, expanding the known world one muddy passage at a time. He was not the type to make mistakes underground, was not prone to exaggeration or drama, and when he told his team via radio 4 months ago that they had found a passageway beyond anything we have mapped, his voice carried the controlled excitement of a professional who had discovered something significant, not the panic of someone who had encountered something that would fundamentally change his understanding of those who live underground. 23 hours later, 3 of the 5 team members emerged from an entrance 7 miles away from where they had entered, and they were not the same people who had gone down. "I want you to do something for me before I continue this account. Hit that like button and leave it there as a marker, a reminder that you were here when you still thought caves were just geological formations, empty spaces in rock where water had dissolved limestone over millions of years and left behind nothing but darkness and silence and the slow drip of mineral-laden water, building formations one molecule at a time. Because what I'm about to tell you about what exists beneath Mammoth Cave, beneath the 400 miles of mapped passages that make it the longest known cave system on Earth, is going to change that understanding permanently, and you'll want evidence that there was a time when you didn't know, when you could still enter a cave without wondering what might be listening from passages that don't appear on any map because they lead somewhere that cartography can't capture. My name is Cole Shepard, and I work as an underground specialist at Mammoth Cave National Park, which is a fancy title for someone who spends most of his time in darkness, surveying unmapped sections, maintaining established routes, rescuing the occasional tourist who wanders off the lit paths, and gets turned around in a system so vast and complex that people have been exploring it for 200 years and still haven't found all of it. Haven't come close to finding all of it, actually, because every year we add new miles to the map, and every year the cave geologists estimate there are hundreds more miles we haven't reached yet. Passages too tight or too flooded or too deep for current exploration methods. Spaces that have been sealed in darkness since the limestone formed from ancient seabeds 300 million years ago. I came to this job from mining engineering. 8 years working in coal operations across Kentucky and West Virginia, where I learned that underground environments follow rules that surface dwellers don't intuitively understand. Rules about airflow and water behavior, and the way rock under pressure does things that seem impossible until you've seen them, until you've watched solid stone flow like liquid over geological time, or heard the sounds that miles of overhead rock make when it's settling, adjusting, reminding you that you're inside something alive, in ways that have nothing to do with biology. That background is probably why Pat Holloway, our superintendent, assigned me to investigate what had happened to Mitchell's team. Why she thought I might be able to understand what they'd encountered in those unmapped passages, and why 2 of the 5 team members hadn't come back at all, while the 3 who did return were no longer entirely human in ways that medical science couldn't explain and that the Park Service couldn't acknowledge without inviting questions that would shut down a cave system that draws 500,000 visitors annually and supports the economy of an entire region. The 3 survivors, Mitchell, plus 2 other experienced cavers named Hannah Reeves and Oscar Fuentes, were found sitting in perfect stillness at the frozen Niagara entrance, one of the tourist access points where visitors exit after the standard cave tours, their headlamps off and their bodies positioned in identical postures with their hands flat on the cave floor and their heads tilted back like they were listening to something, waiting for something, expecting some signal from below that would tell them what to do next. The ranger who found them said they didn't respond to his voice, didn't acknowledge his flashlight beam, didn't react at all until he touched Mitchell's shoulder, at which point all three of them turned their heads toward him simultaneously. Not their bodies, just their heads, rotating further than necks should comfortably allow. And Mitchell spoke those words about finding a way down and something living at the bottom before his language shifted into something else, something that the ranger described as sounds that hurt to hear, frequencies and patterns that created physical discomfort in his ears and his chest. And behind his eyes, Dr. Samuel Vance had been studying Mammoth Cave's geology for 15 years, publishing papers about the cave's formation and hydrology and the unique ecosystem of organisms adapted to permanent darkness. Blind cavefish, cave crayfish, cave beetles, creatures that had evolved without eyes because eyes were useless in an environment that hadn't seen light since the passages formed. When I brought him in to examine the three survivors, hoping his scientific perspective might provide explanations that Park Service protocols couldn't, he spent 4 hours conducting tests and observations before sitting down across from me in the park's research facility with an expression I'd never seen on him before, a look that combined fascination and fear in proportions that suggested he'd found something extraordinary but wished he hadn't. "Their biology has been altered," Samuel said, and his voice had that careful quality scientists use when they're about to say something that sounds insane, but that the evidence supports, regardless of how it sounds. Altered significantly and recently, within the past 24 to 48 hours based on cellular markers, which should be impossible because the kind of changes I'm seeing would normally require generations of evolutionary pressure, not a single day underground. What kind of changes? Their eyes have developed a reflective layer behind the retina, like a cat's tapetum lucidum, which would dramatically improve low-light vision, but which humans don't possess because we evolved as diurnal creatures who relied on daylight. Their skin has lost significant pigmentation, not like albinism, which is genetic, but like the melanin has been actively removed or suppressed, leaving them pale in a way that looks almost translucent under certain lights. Their ears show structural modifications in the inner ear that would enhance sensitivity to low-frequency sounds, the kind of sounds that travel well through rock and water, the kind of sounds you'd need to hear if you lived in an environment where vision was useless and echolocation or vibration detection was your primary sense. You're describing adaptations for living underground, permanent underground, like the cave species that evolved here over millions of years. I'm describing exactly that, except these changes happened in less than 2 days to adult humans who'd spent their entire lives on the surface. That's not evolution. That's not adaptation in any biological sense we understand. That's something else doing this to them deliberately, engineering them for an environment they weren't designed for, making them suitable for somewhere they're apparently supposed to go and not come back from. The two missing team members, a surveyor named Linda Cho and a photographer named Derek Blaine, had been experienced cavers who'd explored Mammoth Cave dozens of times without incident, who'd followed all protocols and carried all appropriate equipment and had no history of taking unnecessary risks underground. Their tracking devices showed they'd descended with the rest of the team through the newly discovered passage, had continued down when the passage went deeper than expected, and then the signals had stopped at a depth of approximately 1,200 feet below the surface, which was deeper than any previously mapped section of Mammoth Cave. Deeper than the cave system was supposed to go based on geological surveys of the region's limestone formations, deeper than made sense given what we understood about how the cave had formed and where its boundaries should be. We need to find them, I told Pat during the emergency meeting she'd called after Samuel delivered his report about the survivors' biological alterations. They've been down there for almost 30 hours now, assuming they're still alive. And if this passage really goes to 1,200 feet or deeper, they could be in conditions we can't predict. Different air composition, different temperatures, geological hazards we've never encountered in the shallower sections. Pat looked at me with the expression I'd come to recognize from superintendents and managers who knew things they couldn't share. Institutional knowledge that got passed down from predecessor to predecessor, but never made it into official documentation because writing it down would make it real, would create records that could be requested and reviewed and questioned by people who hadn't spent years learning why certain information stayed verbal, stayed in the spaces between what was said and what was meant. Cole, what I'm about to tell you stays between us and the people in this room. If it goes further, if it gets to media or to families or to the general public, it will destroy this park and everything we've worked to protect. She pulled out files that weren't stored digitally, weren't in any database I had access to despite my clearance level, physical documents in folders that looked old, some of them dating back decades based on the paper quality and typewriter fonts and faded photographs attached with rusted paper clips. Mammoth Cave isn't the deepest thing in this region. The tourist sections, the mapped passages, even the exploration frontiers where survey teams like Mitchell's are pushing boundaries, all of that is the upper layer of something much older and much larger. Below the cave system we know, there's another system. We call it the deep. How far down does it go? We don't know. We've never found the bottom. We've sent instruments down, probes, and they keep descending until they lose signal or power or both. The geology doesn't make sense. The formations are older than they should be given the age of the limestone above them, composed of materials that shouldn't exist at these depths, arranged in ways that suggest deliberate construction rather than natural processes. And there are organisms, living things that we've detected on sensors but never seen clearly, things that move through those lower passages in groups, communicating with each other in sounds that our equipment picks up but can't interpret. If we've known about this, why haven't we explored it? Why isn't any of this in the scientific literature? Because the exploration teams we sent down didn't come back. Or they came back like Mitchell and Hannah and Oscar, changed, altered, converted into something that isn't quite human anymore, something that seems designed to live down there rather than up here. We stopped sending teams in 1987 after we lost 6 people in a single expedition, and the 3 survivors all died within a month of their return, their bodies rejecting the biological changes that had been made to them, unable to function either underground or on the surface, stuck somewhere between what they'd been and what something had tried to make them become. The files Pat showed me documented 17 expeditions into the deep between 1954 and 1987, a period when the Park Service had apparently believed that exploration and documentation were the appropriate responses to discovering something unprecedented beneath Mammoth Cave rather than containment and concealment, which became the policy after the 1987 disaster that had killed 6 experienced cavers and left 3 more in conditions that made Mitchell's current state look like a mild case of the flu. The expedition reports were clinical in their language but disturbing in their content, descriptions of passages that seemed to reconfigure between visits, that led to different locations depending on which direction you approached them from, that contained formations made of materials that geologists couldn't identify, and that seemed to have been placed rather than grown, constructed by something with purposes that human minds couldn't parse. And then there were the encounters. Not with empty passages or strange minerals, but with inhabitants, with things that lived in the deep and had apparently been living there for a very long time, based on their absolute adaptation to the environment. Creatures that were referenced in the files only as subsurface biologics, but that witnesses described in their debriefings with language that made the bureaucratic terminology seem almost absurdly inadequate humanoid but not human, was the consistent description. bipedal but proportioned wrong, limbs too long and joints in places that didn't match human anatomy, skin that wasn't really skin but something closer to the pale, smooth surface of cave-adapted salamanders, and faces that had features in the right general locations but that didn't move correctly, didn't express emotion or reaction in ways that human faces did, because whatever these things were, they hadn't evolved the social signaling that humans used faces for, hadn't needed to communicate through expression when they lived in darkness, so complete that visual communication was meaningless. The 1987 team made direct contact, Pat continued, her voice carrying the weight of information she'd clearly carried alone for years, waiting for someone she could share it with, someone who needed to know because they were about to go down there and try to retrieve people who probably couldn't be retrieved anymore. Not as the humans they'd been when they descended. They found a settlement, not a colony or a nest or whatever term you'd use for animal habitation. A settlement with structures and organization and evidence of culture, of deliberate choices made by intelligent beings about how to arrange their living space. The team's biologist estimated the settlement could have housed several hundred individuals, and it wasn't the only one. The passages continued beyond it, and in the distance they could hear sounds suggesting other settlements, other populations, a civilization of some kind that existed entirely underground and had apparently existed there for longer than humans had existed on the surface. And the inhabitants let them see all this? Let them walk through their settlement? They did more than let them. They welcomed them in their way, fed them something, food, the team assumed, though they couldn't identify what they were eating. Communicated with them through sounds and gestures that the team couldn't interpret, but that seemed intended to convey meaning, to establish some kind of exchange. The team thought they were making first contact, thought they'd discovered something that would redefine human understanding of intelligent life on Earth, and then they tried to leave. What happened? The inhabitants wouldn't let them. Not aggressively, not violently. They just kept redirecting the team deeper into the settlement, kept showing them more passages and more structures and more of themselves, like they were demonstrating something, proving something, trying to convince the team of something through sheer accumulation of evidence. And the longer the team stayed, the more they started to change. Their eyes adapted. Their skin paled, their hearing shifted toward the frequencies the inhabitants used. The process that happened to Mitchell over 23 hours happened to the 1987 team over the course of 6 days, except it went further because they were exposed longer. By the time they finally escaped, and 3 of them didn't escape, just stopped trying to leave, the 3 survivors were more adapted to the deep than to the surface. The sunlight hurt them. Surface sounds were overwhelming. They couldn't regulate their body temperature in surface conditions. They died because they'd been made into something that couldn't survive up here anymore. But they came up here anyway, because some part of them still remembered being human and wanted to come home. Dominic Russo, my partner and the park's primary cartographer, had been listening to Pat's account with an expression that shifted from skepticism to concern to something approaching acceptance as the evidence accumulated and the institutional documentation proved that this wasn't speculation or legend, but recorded fact that had been deliberately hidden from everyone without sufficient clearance or need to know. When Pat finished, Dominic pulled up his mapping software, the comprehensive 3-dimensional model of Mammoth Cave that represented the cumulative work of surveyors across decades, and he zoomed to the location where Mitchell's team had discovered their passage, the spot where the known system apparently intersected with something much older and much deeper. "The geology here is wrong," Dominic said, pointing to the model in ways that I could follow from my mining background, understanding the implications of what he was showing even if I couldn't have articulated them myself without his expertise. The limestone formations above this point date to the Mississippian period, roughly 320 to 360 million years ago, which is consistent with the rest of Mammoth Cave and the regional geology. But based on the depth readings from Mitchell's team before their signals cut out, They descended into rock that would have to be older than the Mississippian. Much older, maybe Precambrian, which would mean formations that predate complex life on Earth, that formed when the surface was nothing but single-celled organisms, and the atmosphere wasn't even breathable by modern standards. "And what lives in Precambrian rock?" I asked, knowing the answer was nothing, should be nothing, because life hadn't developed the complexity to inhabit underground environments during that era, and nothing from later periods could have migrated down into sealed stone. Nothing should live there. That's the point. Whatever's in the deep isn't something that evolved from surface life and adapted to caves the way the blind fish and crayfish did. It's something else, something that developed down there independently, or something that was already there when the rock formed around it and has been there ever since, which would make it older than any life form we've ever discovered. Older than the fossil record, older than our conception of how long things can exist and remain viable. Right now, I need you to hit subscribe, because what I'm about to describe, my descent into the deep to find Linda and Derek, what I encountered in passages that predate complex life on Earth, what the inhabitants showed me and what they tried to make me become, is the kind of documentation that doesn't exist anywhere else, that parks and governments and scientific institutions suppress because it challenges everything we believe about what lives beneath us and how long it's been there. This channel is dedicated to these suppressed accounts, to rangers and researchers telling truths that official narratives can't accommodate. And if you want to understand what's really underground, not just at Mammoth Cave but in cave systems and mines and excavations around the world, you need to follow this investigation, because the deep isn't unique to Kentucky. It's everywhere, beneath all of us, and the things that live there are aware of us even if we've refused to be aware of them. Pat authorized a 3-person retrieval team, myself, Dominic, and a medic named Yolanda Estrada, who'd been briefed on the biological alterations we might encounter, and who carried equipment designed to counteract or at least slow the adaptation process if we started experiencing the changes that had transformed Mitchell and his surviving teammates. We entered through the tourist section at the historic entrance, descended through mapped passages that I'd traveled hundreds of times during my 6 years at the park, and then deviated at the junction point where Mitchell's team had found their new passage. A crack in the limestone that looked like nothing special, but that led to a crawlway that led to a vertical drop that led to the beginning of something that wasn't on any map and that felt different from the moment we entered it. Not just darker or tighter or more challenging than the known passages, but different in quality, in character, in the way the air tasted and the sounds behaved, and the rock itself felt under our hands as we descended. "My compass is useless here," Dominic said after we'd been descending for about an hour, moving through passages that trended generally downward, but that curved and twisted in ways that made directional tracking unreliable, even with instruments. Magnetic interference, maybe from mineral deposits, but it's complete. I can't get any consistent reading at all. We're navigating by passage shape and gut instinct at this point. The walls were changing as we went deeper, the familiar gray-brown limestone of Mammoth Cave's upper levels giving way to something darker and denser, a black rock that absorbed our headlamp beams rather than reflecting them, that felt older somehow, more compressed, like it had been under pressure for longer than the younger stone above it. I could see what Dominic had meant about the geology being wrong. These weren't formations that should exist beneath Kentucky, weren't consistent with the regional rock strata that I'd studied as part of my mining engineering background. And the deeper we went, the more the passage felt less like a natural void in stone and more like something else, something constructed or at least modified, shaped for purposes that had nothing to do with water dissolution or tectonic movement. At approximately 900 feet below the surface, we found the first evidence that we weren't alone down here, and probably hadn't been since we'd entered the passage markings on the walls. Not geological and not human either, patterns scratched or carved into the black stone in configurations that repeated at regular intervals, like signs or directions or warnings, like the passage was labeled for the benefit of beings who could see in this darkness, and who needed to know where they were going, which tunnels led where and what could be found in each direction. The markings weren't in any symbolic system I recognized, weren't pictographs or letters or numbers in any human sense, but they were clearly meaningful, clearly intentional, and their presence meant that something intelligent came through here regularly enough to need navigation aids. "Look at this," Yolanda said, her headlamp illuminating a section of wall where the markings were accompanied by something else, indentations in the stone that matched the shape of hands, but not human hands, longer and thinner with joints in different places and what looked like additional fingers or maybe claws, impressions left by beings who'd touched this wall so many times that they'd worn their shape into the rock through sheer repetition. Thousands or millions of touches over time spans that made human history look like the blink of an eye. We kept descending, the passage widening as we went deeper, opening from tight crawlways into walking passages and then into chambers that our headlamps couldn't fully illuminate. Spaces so large that the light faded into darkness before reaching the distant walls or ceiling. Caverns that shouldn't exist at these depths, that required geological processes we didn't understand to have formed. And in those caverns, we started to hear them, sounds from deeper down, from passages that led even further into the earth. Sounds that weren't echoes or water or rock settling, but voices. Multiple voices communicating in that same clicking tonal language that Mitchell had been speaking since his return. Language that wasn't designed for human mouths, but that had meaning nonetheless. Conversation and coordination and social interaction happening in the darkness below us, indicating a population, a community, a civilization conducting its daily existence in places that surface humans had never reached and weren't supposed to reach. At 1,100 feet, we found Derek Blaine's camera lying in the middle of a passage, its screen cracked, but the memory card still intact. And when Dominic retrieved the files while Yolanda and I maintained watch on the darkness that pressed in from every direction, we saw footage that confirmed what the 1987 reports had described, but that I still hadn't fully believed until I saw it captured on video, recorded by a man who'd probably known he wasn't coming back to the surface, but who'd wanted to document what he was seeing anyway. Wanted someone to understand what existed in the deep, even if that understanding came too late to save him. The footage showed Linda and Derek continuing down after they'd lost contact with the surface, their tracking signals blocked by the density of the rock above them, pushing deeper because the passage kept going and cavers push until they can't push anymore. It's the nature of the pursuit, the compulsion that drives people underground in the first place, the need to know what's around the next corner, through the next restriction, at the bottom of the next drop. They'd reached a chamber larger than anything in the mapped sections of Mammoth Cave, a void in the stone that Derek's camera struggled to capture because the scale exceeded what the lens could frame. And in that chamber they'd encountered inhabitants for the first time, beings emerging from passages that honeycombed the chamber walls. Dozens of them at first and then more, converging on the two humans with movements that weren't threatening but weren't reassuring either. Purposeful movements that suggested the inhabitants had been expecting visitors, had maybe even drawn them down here through means we couldn't identify. The inhabitants on the footage matched Pat's descriptions from the 1987 files. Humanoid in general structure but wrong in specifics, proportions that evolution hadn't designed for surface life. Adaptations that made sense only if you imagined millions of years of development in absolute darkness, without any input from the world above. Their skin was translucent enough that you could see structures underneath, not organs exactly, but masses and conduits that pulsed with some kind of circulation, and their faces had features that corresponded to human features in placement but not in function. Where eyes should be, there were smooth depressions that might have been vestigial sockets, or might have been something else entirely. sensory apparatus that detected things other than light, and their mouths were wider than human mouths, with more mobility in the lips and cheeks, adapted for the complex vocalizations we'd been hearing from below since we entered the deep. Derek's narration on the footage was strained but controlled, professional to the end. They're guiding us somewhere, not forcing but definitely directing, and Linda's going with them. We discussed it and decided that resistance would be pointless and possibly dangerous given their numbers, so we're cooperating and documenting as much as we can. The temperature down here is warmer than above, there's moisture and there are sounds of water, and I'm seeing what look like cultivated areas in the passages we're passing, organisms growing on the walls that might be food sources, and structures that aren't natural formations but constructed things, built by intelligent beings for purposes I can't identify. If anyone finds this camera, tell the park that the deep isn't empty and isn't dead. It's a functioning ecosystem with intelligent inhabitants, and they've been down here a very long time, and they want something from us that I don't understand yet, but that I think involves us staying here permanently. The footage continued for another 20 minutes, showing passages that got progressively more developed, more structures, more inhabitants, more evidence of deliberate design and long-term occupation, before the camera was apparently set down and the recording ended, either because Derek had stopped recording or because he'd been separated from the equipment, leaving behind the only artifact of his descent for us to find and interpret and use to decide whether we were going to keep going down after him and Linda, or whether we were going to turn back, report what we'd found, and accept that some people who went into the deep didn't come back because they weren't supposed to come back. Because the deep wanted to keep them. We keep going, I said, and I could hear in my own voice the same compulsion that had driven Derek and Linda to continue down when they should have turned around. The cavers' need to see what was next, to push beyond the known into the unknown even when the unknown was clearly dangerous, clearly inhabited by things that had plans for any humans who reached them. Linda and Derek might still be retrievable if we reach them fast enough before the biological changes progress too far for them to survive on the surface. Dominic looked at me with an expression that said he knew I was rationalizing, knew that the real reason I wanted to keep going was the same reason every caver kept going. Because the passage continued and what was ahead mattered more than what was behind. But he nodded anyway, because he was a caver too and he understood the pull, and Yolanda checked her medical kit and confirmed she had supplies for at least 2 more people if we found them in treatable condition, and we continued down into the deep, toward the sounds and the inhabitants and whatever was waiting for us in chambers where intelligent beings had been living since before humans existed on the surface to wonder what might be underneath them. The passage we followed from the camera location descended steeply for another 300 vertical feet, and with every foot of depth, the environment changed more dramatically, the temperature rising toward what felt like the mid-70s, humidity increasing until the air felt thick and organic in our lungs, sounds becoming clearer and more complex as we approached whatever central area the inhabitants occupied, wherever the population was concentrated and the civilization they'd built had its heart. We started seeing more of the cultivated sections that Derek had described, patches of wall covered in organisms that glowed faintly with bioluminescence, providing the first light we'd seen since entering the deep that wasn't from our own headlamps, pale blue-green illumination that wasn't bright enough to see by human standards, but that would be plenty for beings whose other senses had developed to compensate for sightlessness. And then the passage opened into the chamber, and we saw what Derek's camera had only partially captured because the scale required direct experience to comprehend, required standing in the space and letting your brain struggle with dimensions that exceeded what evolution had prepared it to process. The chamber was at least 1,000 feet across and several hundred feet high, a void in the earth that shouldn't exist based on any geological principle I'd learned in mining engineering school, and it was full of structures. Not formations, Not stalactites or flowstone or anything produced by mineral deposition, but buildings, constructions made from the black stone of the deep and arranged in patterns that indicated urban planning, community organization, the deliberate choices of intelligent beings creating a living space that met their needs and reflected their values and demonstrated their capabilities. There were hundreds of the structures, maybe thousands, connected by paths and bridges and vertical shafts that allowed movement in 3 dimensions, since beings who'd evolved in caves wouldn't be limited to horizontal travel the way surface creatures were. And moving through and among the structures were the inhabitants, more than I could count, going about activities that I couldn't interpret, but that clearly represented the daily functioning of a society. A civilization that had existed in this chamber and others like it for timescales that made human history look like a brief flash, a momentary spark in the long darkness of geological time. If you're watching this and your brain is struggling to accept what I'm describing, a civilization beneath Kentucky that predates human existence, intelligent beings who've been living in the deep for millions of years while we've been on the surface for a couple 100,000, hit that like button because you're going to need to remember this moment, this point where your understanding of what's possible began to shift. Because what happened next when the inhabitants noticed us and decided to show us what they wanted from the surface world is going to push that shift even further, is going to make you reconsider every assumption you have about humanity's place on this planet, and whether we're really the dominant intelligent species, or whether we've just been living in the attic of a house occupied by something much older and much more established that has tolerated our presence so far, but that might have other plans for us now that we've finally found the door to their level. They knew we were there the moment we entered the chamber, maybe before, probably tracking our descent since we'd entered the deep, aware of us in ways that didn't require vision because they had other senses. Better senses for this environment than anything humans possessed. A group of them approached, maybe 12 or 15, moving with a coordination that suggested communication I couldn't hear, decisions made collectively and instantaneously, and they surrounded us without making any threatening gestures, simply positioned themselves in a circle with us at the center, and then one of them stepped forward and made sounds at us, that clicking tonal language that Mitchell had been speaking since his return, and I realized they were trying to communicate, trying to tell us something or ask us something in a language we didn't know and couldn't learn quickly enough for this encounter to involve any real exchange of information. But then another one stepped forward, and this one looked different from the others, not in structure or proportion, but in something else. Something about the way it carried itself and the way the others positioned themselves around it that suggested status, authority, importance in whatever hierarchical system this society used. And when it made sounds, they weren't in the clicking language. They were in English. Heavily accented, strangely inflected, but recognizable. Words formed by a mouth that hadn't evolved for human speech, but that had learned it anyway, had acquired our language somehow and could use it to communicate with us directly. "You come from above," it said, and the voice had a quality that I can only describe as old, not tired or weak, but layered with time, like every word had been considered for centuries before being spoken. "You seek the ones who came before you, the ones we are making suitable." "Where are they?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to treat this as a negotiation rather than an encounter with something so far beyond my experience that my brain wanted to shut down rather than process it. "Where are Linda and Derek? We need to bring them back to the surface." "They cannot return to the surface. The process has progressed beyond reversal. They are becoming what they need to become to exist here, where they will remain, where they wish to remain now that they understand what existence here offers." "What does it offer? What do you want with surface humans?" The being was silent for a moment, its face unreadable because it wasn't a human face and didn't express the way human faces did, and then it made a gesture toward the chamber around us, toward the city and the inhabitants, and the civilization that filled this impossible space beneath the earth. "We have existed here since before your kind walked on 2 legs. We were here when the stone above us was ocean floor. We're here when the first organisms developed the complexity to be called alive by your definitions. We are old. We are established. And we are not able to leave this place, not able to survive in conditions that exist above. The light destroys us. The air composition is toxic to our biology. We evolved here, and we are bound here, and this has been acceptable for millions of years because we did not know what we were missing, did not conceive of anything beyond these chambers and passages. It stepped closer, and I could see details I'd missed before, scars or marks on its skin that might have been decoration or rank indicators, textures that suggested age even though I had no framework for judging how old a being like this might be or how its appearance would change over time. But we have learned. From the ones who came down and stayed, from the ones we made suitable, we have learned about the surface, about light that doesn't destroy, about space that extends to infinity in all directions instead of being bounded by stone, about other intelligences, your kind, existing in conditions that seem miraculous to us, impossible to us, and we have wondered if we might share those conditions, if there might be ways for us to adapt as we have adapted you. You want to come to the surface? You want us to help you reach the surface? We want to understand if it is possible to modify ourselves as we modify you, to become suitable for above as we make you suitable for below. The exchange would be equitable. Some of your kind living here, some of our kind living there. Knowledge and capability flowing in both directions. We have much to offer. Technologies you have not developed. Understanding of this planet that you have not reached. We have been here for so long, have learned so much, and we wish to share it with intelligences who can appreciate it, who can reciprocate with knowledge of your own. I looked at Dominic and Yolanda, saw my own uncertainty reflected in their faces, the impossibility of making this decision on behalf of humanity, of representing our entire species in a negotiation with beings who'd existed since before we were capable of negotiating anything. We can't agree to that here. We're not authorized to make that kind of arrangement. We'd need to bring this back to people who have the authority to. The ones you seek are here, the being interrupted, and it gestured toward one of the structures where figures were emerging. 2 figures that moved like humans, but that had already changed, already adapted partway toward what the inhabitants were. Pale skin and reflective eyes and proportions that were shifting subtly toward the elongated forms of the Deep's native residents. Linda and Derek, recognizable but altered, looking at us with expressions that combined recognition and something else. Something that might have been pity or might have been satisfaction. The look of people who'd found something they hadn't known they were searching for and who couldn't understand why everyone wasn't searching for it too. They will speak with you, the being said. They will explain what existence here offers, what they have gained by becoming suitable, and then you will decide. Return to the surface with this knowledge and share it with your authorities and begin the process of formal exchange, or remain here and become suitable yourselves. Join the community that has welcomed you and exists in ways your surface civilization cannot imagine. The choice is yours. We do not compel. I need you to pause and drop a comment telling me what you think the right choice is here, because I stood in that chamber facing a decision that would affect not just me, but potentially all of humanity. Accept an alliance with beings who've existed for millions of years and have knowledge we can't imagine, or reject contact because the cost of exchange might be people transformed into something no longer quite human, people who could never return to surface life. What would you do? Trust the offer and become an ambassador for a relationship between surface and deep, or retreat and recommend that the entrance be sealed, that we pretend we never found what's down there? I made my choice, and I'll tell you what happened because of it. But I want to know what you would have done facing something ancient and alien and genuinely offering exchange, rather than conquest. Linda and Derek spoke with us for almost an hour, explaining their transformation and what it felt like, what they could perceive now that they couldn't before, how their understanding of existence had expanded since they'd begun adapting to the deep. They weren't captives, they insisted. They'd chosen to stay after the inhabitants had shown them what life here could be, had decided that becoming suitable was preferable to returning to a surface world that would seem limited and shallow after what they'd experienced below. They didn't try to convince us to stay, just offered their perspective, and I could tell they meant it, could tell they genuinely believed they'd found something better, and that they were happy to remain in the deep for the rest of their lives. However long those lives might be for beings who'd been modified by organisms millions of years old. We returned to the surface after 13 hours underground, climbing back through the deep and into Mammoth Cave's mapped sections, and finally emerging into Kentucky daylight that seemed harsh and flat after the bioluminescent glow of the chamber, sound that seemed crude and simple after the complex communications of the inhabitants, air that seemed thin and empty after the rich organic atmosphere of the deep. We reported everything to Pat, who listened with an expression that mixed horror and fascination, who understood the implications of what we were describing, who knew that this information would eventually reach levels of government that would have to decide how to respond to the discovery that humanity shared the planet with another intelligent civilization that wanted to establish formal relations. The entrance to the passage has been sealed now, officially closed for geological instability, and the 3 survivors from Mitchell's team, Mitchell, Hannah, and Oscar, have been moved to a secure facility where their transformations are being studied and where they're being kept away from media and public awareness while decisions are made about what to do with the knowledge they represent. I don't know what those decisions will be. Don't know if humanity will accept the exchange the inhabitants offered, or will choose to pretend the deep doesn't exist, sealing it away and hoping the beings below will stay below rather than finding other ways to reach us. But I know they're down there. Know they've been there since before we existed, and will be there long after we're gone. If we choose not to engage with them. Know they want to come up as much as they want us to go down. Want to experience the surface world they've been learning about from transformed humans, who've described light and space and air in terms that must seem like fantasy to beings who've never known anything but stone and darkness, and the bounded chambers they've occupied for geological ages. Mammoth Cave's official length is over 400 miles, the longest cave system in the world, and every year we add new passages to the map as survey teams push the boundaries of the known. But beneath those 400 miles is something older and larger and occupied by intelligences that have been waiting for us to find them. And now that we have, the question isn't whether to make contact. We've already made contact. But what that contact will become, what relationship surface and deep will develop now that we know about each other and have to decide whether to be neighbors or strangers, allies or something else that I don't have words for, because humanity has never faced this situation before and doesn't have concepts for what comes next. Some passages lead deeper than the maps show. Some passages lead to places that were old when our ancestors were still learning to walk upright. And some passages lead to beings who've been watching our development from below, waiting for us to become interesting enough to engage with, and who've decided we're finally ready to know they exist. The deep is real. The inhabitants are real. And whatever comes next, exchange or isolation, alliance or separation, will be the most significant decision humanity has ever made, because it will define our relationship with intelligences that were here first and that will be here long after we're gone, unless we find ways to make ourselves suitable for wherever existence takes us, above or below or somewhere in between. I'm still working at Mammoth Cave, still guiding tourists through passages they think are the whole story, still knowing that beneath their feet is something vast and ancient and waiting to see what we decide to do with the knowledge we've gained. And every time I descend into the darkness, every time I pass the sealed entrance to the deep and feel the faint vibrations of activity below, I wonder if I made the right choice coming back to the surface, or if I should have stayed and become suitable, and joined a civilization that's existed since before time had any meaning to anything that could measure it. The passages go deeper than the maps show. They always have. And now we know what's at the bottom, waiting for us to decide whether to go down or to stay up, or to find some middle ground that lets both worlds exist without one having to consume the other. That choice is still being made, and every day it isn't made is another day the deep waits and watches and wonders what will become.